So there's a crisis brewing in Iran, and it's escalating fast. It's sending shockwaves all around the world. In this explainer, we're going to break down what's happening on the ground, the incredibly high-stakes choices the United States is facing, and what it all means for a key regional player, India. And things really heated up with this one statement from U.S. President Donald Trump. Help is on its way. Now, was that a promise, or was it a threat? Whatever he meant by it, those words have seriously turned up the heat, making an already tense situation feel like it's about to explode. But, behind all this political talk, there's a devastating human cost. Just think about this number for a second. 2,500. That's how many people have reportedly been killed since protests first broke out on December 28th. It's a really chilling reminder of what's truly at stake here. So let's look inside Iran. The situation there has absolutely reached a boiling point. You've got more and more people taking to the streets, and the regime's response? It's been a brutal crackdown, coupled with a communications blackout, basically trying to silence a movement that just keeps growing. And all of this puts the U.S. administration in a really tough spot. So what are their options, really? And maybe more importantly, what are the consequences of whatever they decide to do? Which brings us right to America's high-stakes choice. The decisions being made in Washington right now could completely reshape the entire Middle East. The stakes are just that high. Okay, so the U.S. is basically at a fork in the road here. On one hand, you've got diplomacy, and we really can't underestimate this, right? Iranian officials, they're incredibly skilled negotiators, and their main goal is always the survival of their regime. But then on the other hand, the White House is making it very clear that, quote, all other options remained on the table. And if you want a perfect example of how good they are at this, just look at the JCPOE nuclear deal. Remember when the Obama administration really tightened the screws with sanctions? The regime didn't collapse. Nope. They negotiated. For them, diplomacy is a survival tool, plain and simple. It shows they know how to play the long game, to make sure they stay in power. Now, officially, the U.S. says it's on board with this. You have the White House press secretary saying diplomacy is always the first option. But listen carefully to the wording there. It's the first option. That kind of implies it's not the only one, right? And sure enough, she immediately followed up by saying the president is unafraid to use military options. So, the big question is, what happens if talks break down, if diplomacy fails? Well, that's where we get to the military playbook. Let's actually unpack what those other options could look like on the ground. Military experts talk about a kind of three-step ladder of escalation. First up, you have what they call calibrated attacks. Think surgical strikes against military buildings, command centers, that sort of thing. If that's not enough, step 2 gets way riskier, targeting the leaders themselves, something like what we saw with the killing of Qasem Soleimani. And then, at the very top of that ladder, you have step 3, the most extreme option of all, a full-blown ground offensive. That's what it would probably take for actual regime change, but it would face massive political backlash back home. And this really gets to the heart of the strategic problem for the U.S. There's a great quote from a senior diplomat who said, "It is very difficult to do a regime change from 30,000 feet above." What he means is, sure, you can weaken a regime with air power, but to actually topple it, that almost always means you need boots on the ground. And that takes you right back to that incredibly controversial third step. And let's be clear, the U.S. is already in position for action. There is a huge naval force. We're talking multiple destroyers and combat ships like the ones you're seeing here, already stationed in the Arabian Gulf and the Red Sea. This is not just a defensive move. It's what you'd call an aggressive posture. It's all about projecting force and sending a crystal-clear message to Tehran that the military option is very, very real. But here's the thing. A conflict like this wouldn't just happen in a bubble. So let's zoom out a bit and look at this from another crucial angle. How is a country like India watching all of this unfold? For India, the first big worry is energy. Look at this. Almost 60% of India's energy comes from the Middle East. So any instability there is a direct threat to India's energy supply. It could send fuel prices soaring and trigger a massive economic crisis. And then there's the human side of this, which is just immense. 9 million, just let that sink in. That's roughly how many Indian citizens are living and working in that region. If a conflict broke out, keeping them safe would be New Delhi's #1 priority, and honestly, it would be a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. So for India, this is a tangled web of really tough challenges. On one hand, it's walking a diplomatic tightrope. It can't really afford to alienate the US, but supporting military action would be incredibly difficult. And at the same time, it's got to worry about its energy, the safety of millions of its people, and the fact that a war would destabilize its entire neighborhood. And all of this brings us to one final crucial question. We're really at a tipping point here. With all this pressure building up, can diplomacy actually work? Can the art of talking and compromise diffuse a conflict that's threatening to swallow up an entire region and maybe even disrupt the whole world?